Podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to this final webinar of the 2018 More to Life webinar series, in which we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Deborah Sloan. Hi Deborah.
Hello Heather, it's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you. Deborah is a counsellor and creative writing facilitator. She runs support groups and writing workshops for people living with fertility issues, dementia, and those recovering from addiction. She believes that creative writing techniques can be powerful tools in the process of self-discovery and healing. We will begin this webinar tonight with Deborah's presentation, and then we'll move on to a short Q&A session. You can type in the questions as we go, but come back to them once Deborah is finished. We'll come back to them anyway. Now, we do ask that you answer these questions or ask these questions anonymously, just to prevent any personal data being disclosed, because this session will be recorded tonight. All you have to do if you want to ask a question is hover your cursor down at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a Q&A function appear. Just type your questions into that if you have any as we go. I think we are ready to hand over to you now, Deborah, just to show us how keeping a journal and writing can help us process any unexpressed grief that we may be feeling.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's a real honour to be here. I'm really pleased to be doing my first webinar for More to Life, and I'm really excited to be sharing some of my ideas and my work. I run workshops, creative writing workshops, and I'm hoping to be sharing some of the things that I do, and as well as my own experience of how creative writing has helped me in my journey with childlessness as well. In the time that I've got, I don't have enough time to give you the definitive guide to journal writing, the definitive guide to poetry. It's just not possible. But what I want to do is to give you some food for thought, something to take away with you, maybe to start thinking if you haven't already started journaling, or if you've not got any experience of reading and writing poetry. So what this session is about giving you a little insight into how you can use poetry and journal writing, your own expressive writing, to help you in your work with your feelings regarding living without children. So this isn't therapy, but the results can be therapeutic. I'm going to say that I am 54 years old, and I am a woman who's childless not by choice. And I think that's very important for me to say that, because, and why I'm saying it is because I've had almost 20 years, 2 decades of my own journey, and using my poetry and using other people's poetry and my journaling. So I feel as if I've kind of felt my way over these past 2 decades. And when I was going through those first few years of that, the sort of the peak of the grief, if you will, there wasn't so much out there to help. There weren't the blogs and the webinars and things. So I kind of had to feel my way. And so I'm hoping that has given me a richness to what I'm going to share with you tonight. And since I'm going to talk about journaling first, and if I keep looking over to my right, by the way, it's because I've got my notes here. I've also got my phone to keep the time, so I don't go over time. But since I'm going to talk about journaling first, what I'm going to do is to share with you a journal entry that I wrote almost 2 decades ago. And there is a little bit of a story to how I rediscovered this journal entry, which I think might give you some insight into the power of journal writing. So I normally journal. I don't journal every day, but I journal when I need to and I want to. And one morning I was journaling as normal, and I came to the end of my journal, no blank pages left. And I will confess here and now that I'm a bit of a journal tart, and I do tend to, if I find a new beautiful journal before I've ended the journal I'm working on, I sometimes skip a few pages and move on to the new beautiful journal, even more beautiful journal that I've just got. And so what I did was I went to my shelf and I picked at random a journal, and lo and behold, there were some pages in the back. So I took the journal and sat down to start writing again. And there on the facing page was this entry that I'd written almost 2 decades before. I'm going to read it to you. I think it's good to read it. So I said, "That's it. No more visits to the clinic. Told in no uncertain terms there is no hope left. No one, not even the consultant, would bet on me. At times I feel unable to function as a person, a woman, a sister, a daughter or a wife. I just feel, so what? Some days I feel like driving too fast and a voice inside me says, what would it matter if I died? But then the wife, daughter, friend, sister cries out and I seem to flood back into myself. The question I keep asking myself is, how long am I allowed to grieve? As I become older, how much can I expect the world to recognise that even an old woman can still feel the pain of childlessness? I look in the mirror and I just don't know who I see anymore. What will it be like when I'm 40? I dread being a 50-year-old childless woman expected to dote on other people's babies. If only I could know how it will be not being a mother. If only I could know I will be okay." And reading that again, I instantly was back there, and I remember writing that. And it was like a time capsule. And the results of actually seeing it again were twofold, really. One is that I could remember the catharsis of getting some of these really, really complicated, really profound feelings down on the page. Some of these things I couldn't admit to anyone else, but I could admit it to my journal. And just being able to write that, the fact that I doubted my worthiness is such a shame, felt such a shameful thing to admit to. And yet there I could say it on the page, and it was made it real and tangible, and it made it something that I could deal with. The other result was that I could see how far I'd come. It gave me a reason to celebrate. I am that 50-something-year-old woman. I have survived. I am the wife, the sister, the aunt. Now I'm an aunt, and very, very proud of being that. And that was something to really celebrate. And it made me, as much as I wanted to reach into the page and give that 36-year-old woman a hug and say, you will be okay, you are going to be okay, I can promise. It was also a great way of celebrating who I am. It also allowed me to forgive myself a little bit and to realise that I was human. And that feeling was also there when I was writing the diary as well. I was writing my journal, and I was able to look at it and say, well, maybe I can cut myself some slack on this, because the feelings are so powerful. So journaling is something that many of us do. You might have kept a teenage diary. I don't know if any of you listen to Radio 4's My Teenage Diary. It's hilarious. Some of the things that are written in their diaries is absolutely hilarious. And I read my teenage diary sometimes. I've still got them, and oh my goodness, cringeworthy. But we won't go there. I'm not going to share any of my teenage diary with you at all. And it's what it is, you know, when you're in those teenage years, you've got so much going on in your head. There's so much angst going on in your head. There's a diary, a journal is somewhere to dump them all. There's somewhere you can write it, you can shut the book and you can walk away. And it's a way of externalizing all the chaos that's going around. And I think that's a really important thing about the journal. And just having it somewhere that you can leave it. can really enhance your sense of well-being. And equally as an adult, we become overwhelmed with our feelings, and especially when we have moments of grief and times of grief, and navigating the grief of childlessness is no less so. These things, the grief of childlessness can feel like this huge amorphous mass. You just don't know where to start and how to but sometimes it's almost impossible to verbalize those feelings. And talking is a wonderful way of understanding, accessing people to support you. But I think that journaling, the act of writing, really enables us to slow down, to mull things over. It allows us to engage that slow part of the brain that can help us reach for a word, the perfect word that we want to describe, a way to describe an experience that might otherwise be unwordable. And one of the things that happened to me in my early years, the first years of navigating my grief, was that I began to feel like a very incoherent being. And by that, I don't mean that I was drunk and no one can understand me. What I mean is that I felt that parts of me were kind of fragmenting away, and that I felt a bit like a fragmented being. And what journaling did was allowed me to gather those parts of myself again, to see things on the page, to be able to mull things over on the page. And the act of writing it down as well was really therapeutic. There is evidence about journal writing and expressive writing. So it's not just something that's very ethereal. Somebody called James Pennebaker, and his book, one of his books is actually on the information sheet that Heather might have mentioned, that she will be sending out to you. And he did a study in 2004 and simply asked people to write for 15 minutes a day. I think it was for a month, or a couple of weeks, and write down their feelings, even if they were traumatic. And what he found at the end of it was that people's pain, experience of pain, had physical and emotional pain had reduced. Their blood pressure had reduced. They had a sense of psychological well-being. They were able to sleep better as well. Just the mere act of writing their feelings down, they didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to create a novel out of their feelings. They just had to write their feelings down. So if that is the positive side of journaling, why do we stop, or why do we not start at all? And it's something that I ask myself as well, because after my teenage years, I had a big gap. I didn't really write. And my journaling was a bit sporadic as well. And one of the things that stopped me journaling was the thought, or the perception that there is a set of rules about journaling. We all have this maybe you don't, but I have this idea of journaling or writing a diary, the Victorian woman sitting at her dressing table writing her diary and writing it every day. And I call it, what I call it is the tyranny of the date on the page. So my journaling would be very much sort of day one, write with great enthusiasm. Day two, write with a little bit less enthusiasm. Day three, I would skip. Day four, I would start with an apology to day three. And how ridiculous is that? We don't have to apologize in our journal. So you don't have to journal every day. You can journal whenever you want to. And in fact, Pennebaker, the chap I just mentioned, says that it's probably more therapeutic to just journal when you need to or you want to, and maybe untherapeutic to journal every day if just because you think you have to. Another rule that I felt there was spurious rule, was that my journal had to look a certain way. And it doesn't have to look a certain way. You can have a page of expletives if you want, give that a go. You can have doodles, you can have pictures. And a few of my pages are I've printed out photographs of something that happened on a particular day, and all I've done is write 3 lines under it. And that's absolutely fine. If that's what you want to do in your journal, it's your journal, you do that. Then the next slide here, I'm going to just go through some reasons to journal. Forgive me if my face is over some of the writing. Do forgive me. I'll move it if I need to. So, reasons to journal. First and foremost, I consider my journal as my space, no one else's space. No one else is going to see it. If you want to, with your journal, you can, a lot of people say to me, well, what happens if, God forbid, something happens to me and my journals are there? You can write in your will that you want your journals to be burned if you want. I'm a bit more narcissistic. I think, oh, maybe somebody will read them in the future and they'll be there for posterity. Your journal doesn't judge you. You write in your journal because it's a safe space for you to write in, and so your journal can't judge you. It gives you time, as I said, to mull over and explore your feelings, which is really important. Allows for that slow thinking as opposed to the fast thinking of verbalizing. Sometimes we feel under pressure when even in social situations, because we often don't get that space to talk, to take time to actually find the right word, find the right phrase to express what's going on inside. Gives us the opportunity to repeat stuff. But what's really important is it can give us the opportunity to repeat stuff in a different way. So if you find, and this is quite an important concept actually, if you find you're repeating stuff over and over again, you can try and repeat it in a different way. And in the next slide, I'm going to go on to talk about tips for journaling. I can give you some tips for that. Journaling can transform chaos into something more tangible, more organized. If your journal entry for today or tomorrow is a list, that's absolutely fine. You can list your feelings. You can have a list of things that annoyed you today, and maybe accompany that with a list of things that made you feel good today. The movement of the pen and hand across the page, the rhythm of writing, can really bring us into ourselves and really kind of be a comfort. Even if you can type your journal, that's not a problem. Just being able to type something that's not a business email, and it's not it's not answering something that you have to answer. It's not writing a report. It's writing for you, and just that tickety-tack of writing something for you on your computer equally can be quite calming. Journaling is a place to honour the grief of childlessness. And this is really key. I find this in my journaling practice. Celebrating joy is equally as important. It's very important to honour the grief of your childlessness. But I think being able to find something in the day, find something in the week that has really captured you, even if it was fleeting, even if it was just a moment of peace, a moment of joy, a photograph of that moment even, is really key. And Pennebaker talks about this in his book as well. He says that people who fare better psychologically are people who do try and find those moments of joy to write about as well. It's a place to reframe your story. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. So maybe a way of stopping repeating the same story over and seeing it from a different angle. Quite simply, journaling is about taking time out and being in that moment. It's just for you. And I think that's a really important thing in our fast living world today. You can use your diary or your journal in conjunction with therapy if you like. You can read out journal entries in a session. But what I would say is that maybe try to avoid writing for your therapist. We can all have an unconscious audience when we're writing. The power of a journal is that the journal is just for you, you're writing for you. So if you want to, if you think it's useful, you could write a page that you have dedicated to read out in your therapy session, and explore it more. Again, it's a way of trying to find the right words and being able to share it with somebody else. Somebody can be a witness to that. Tips for journaling. Thought it might be an idea to give you some idea of the kinds of things that you can actually do and not do as well. So what I would say is, don't restrict or push yourself. Write when you want to, in whatever format you want to, and importantly, stop when you want to. If something's becoming very difficult or traumatic, and you're getting some very difficult feelings you don't think you're going to be able to process, just stop. And equally, don't restrict yourself to certain days. Don't restrict yourself to writing every day. And don't push yourself to write if you don't want to. One of the things that might be useful, if you're stuck for time and you think, I just want to write a little bit, set a timer and write just whatever comes into your head. Don't stop to think about it. Just write, and don't think about punctuation or spelling. And then close your journal and walk away. Reframing your story, what I was speaking about in the just a little while ago. If you find you're telling the same story over and over again, you might even be a bit bored with it. I mean, it's important to be able to say things as many times as you want to, but it can be very powerful to use a journal to write this story, say in a third person. So instead of saying I all the time, talk about he or she, or it even. You could write about it as an inanimate object. Write as an observer at a scene. So if you're writing about the same situation all the time, be another person in that scene and write it from that person's point of view. Or again, from an inanimate object's point of view. It's quite striking sometimes when we start to open up our imagination and write from a different perspective, and we see different things. It's a bit like when they need witnesses to something that's happened. So many witnesses have different stories about, it depends on where you are and who you are in the scene, really, can change the story. And this is quite important, I think. Recognize when you're becoming mired in the same negative speak. Acknowledge the difficult stuff, but celebrate the positive. And push yourself to find some positive words, or even less negative ones. And a journal is a great way of keeping track of that. So if you noticed over the last a month or so that you've been saying the same negative things and repeating the same negative speak, push yourself maybe to find a different, more positive way of expressing that. And importantly, write for yourself and for no one else. I'm quite confident that my journal is safe. Nobody looks at my journal. If you need to find somewhere to put your journal so that it's just for you, then you know, that's fine. You can do that. I have journals all over the house, and I think probably my husband would be very bored to read them anyway. So those are my tips for journaling. And what I found was, just to kind of sum up what journaling did for me, it helped me to gather myself. It still helps me to gather myself, and bring that coherence. It gives me, it helps me to make sense of my experience. I think that's what we, as human beings, we really need to do, is to make sense of whatever experience it is that we have, especially our difficult experiences. And that's what journaling has done for me. I'm going to move on to poetry now, because poetry has really helped me find coherence, find sense, and it does so in a kind of a slightly in a different way, but equally powerful way as journaling does. And the next slide is a poem that I'm going to read you by somebody called Lois Williams, and she has given me very kind permission to use this poem in full. And I'm going to read it out. I'll just move myself. I'm not quite sure how this looks to you, but I'm going to move myself over to the other side. And Lois Williams has written a collection of poems, and it is about her experience of living with the knowledge that she wouldn't have children, and about the moments of joy as well as the moments of upset and grief in her life. And it's a very powerful collection, and the reference to that is on the information sheet as well. Poetry is meant to be read out loud. That was, we believe, the source of poetry was a way of remembering stories, and the poetry is meant to be read out loud. So I'm going to read this to you. Traffic. In the drab half hour before the office closes, or sometimes late at night, I think of them, the children I didn't have and tried to. They are 6, 7, 10. Their genders change. None of them is the same child week to week. I haven't named them. They turn up with a football or crisps, wearing puffy coats, so maybe it's November. And they hang around waiting, I think, for me to look down the road to see if traffic's coming. It always is. And they're not near enough to hear me. But they do that sibling thing, jostle and lean in a pyramid of shoulders, my trio of wanteds, my immaterials, the weight of non-entity sticking them together. It's not sorrow I feel, but a kind of shyness in being not their mother, so that when they look over and beckon me to see which one of them's the tallest, fastest, hold their breath the longest, I hesitate, a girl again, not sure I'll be allowed to join the playground game. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that this is a really, really powerful poem. And for me, it kind of sums up the power in poetry. What we do is we turn to poetry at very difficult times and joyful times. And why not every day we can turn to poetry? And I think what Lois's poem here has done is show how the condensing of the words on the page, and you probably notice as well the white space around it. And to me, that white space says everything about giving us thinking space. It says everything about allowing us to make from the poem, to extract our own experience from the poem. The other thing, really important thing I think it does, is it allows us to dovetail the physical with the psychological, or the physical with the intellectual, if you like, the thinking being with the physical being. And sometimes when we have very difficult experiences like grief, like living with grief, very often we can separate the head from the body, and we forget to think about how our body feels, and our body somehow is not registering how our emotions are feeling in a conscious way. Sometimes it can all happen without us realizing. And I think poetry has that really powerful thing about using very specific words, slowing us down, using the specific words that convey a meaning. And the things in this poem that strike me is, I mean, for a lot of people who are living with childlessness, we have the potential child, the child that wasn't born, Many people see that child very clearly. Some people, it's a vague notion of a child. For some people, it might be very, very ephemeral. But what I think she's done there beautifully is show that real conflict between having that potential child in our mind and not knowing what to do with it, because we don't know whether we are a mother or a parent, and we're not the parent to those children. And that image of the children jostling and leaning in a pyramid of shoulders is just so powerful to me, and I hope it is to you as well. You don't have to feel like that for a poem. It's a very personal thing. And if you didn't get any of that from the poem, then that's absolutely fine as well. So I think what poetry does is it shares something of our inner being, not just the mind, but our hearts and our blood and our gut and our womb. There's something in the rhythms, there's something in the cadence and the rhymes and the word echoes, and something in the white space around the words that really gives gives a different depth to an experience that's shared in a poem. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to do a little writing exercise. You don't have to do it, but you're very welcome to if you want to. So as I tell you or invite you to do the task, there'll be minutes or a couple of minutes of silence. So whilst you write, which is absolutely fine. And the purpose of this exercise is to kind of show you that poetry doesn't have to be complicated or flowery. And I think you'll see from Lois's poem here that the language is very simple and unflowery. It's very very lean as well, and it's you notice the very thin kind of line that it makes. It doesn't have to have lots of words. So what I'm going to ask you to do to get into this exercise is to think of a moment recently, or it could be not so recently, a moment where you felt really good, that you felt a moment of joy, or you felt a great sense of well-being. And take a moment to think of that, and I'm going to give you a minute to write a couple of sentences describing that situation. So I'm literally going to time a minute on my phone, and there'll be silence while you write that. So just a couple of sentences, that's all. So that's just a minute, and I hope I've given you enough time to write a couple of sentences. It's amazing how long a minute can seem when there's silence. But silence is a great thing as well. I think it's a really good thing to practice, is our capacity for silence. So you've written a couple of sentences. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to pick out 1, 2, or 3 words from what you've written that will form the first line of your poem. It's going to be like a list poem. I did this exercise as well. I gave myself the same amount of time, I chose, we bought new duvets the other day. How exciting. But there was that lovely moment when you get into bed with the new duvets. And so I chose that moment. And so the 3 words I chose for my first line were bed at last. So I'm going to ask you to choose your one, and it can be 1, 2, or 3 words. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be any more than that. So I'll give you about 30 seconds just to choose those 3 words. Okay, so that's 30 seconds. Now all you need to do is follow on with 4 or 5 lines that contain 1, 2, or 3 words describing your experience. And what's important here is I want you, or I invite you, to focus on your senses. This is that thing about gathering ourselves and bringing the psychological and the physical together. So think about touch, taste, sight, sound, and scent, and engage with everything that was going on in your moment when you felt good. And write 4 or 5 lines just using 1, 2, or 3 words. So for example, what I wrote was bed at last, smooth cotton, skin soothed, scent of sun, dark air on tongue, lulled, falling, fall. And just try not to think too much about it, just to be able to kind of feel your way with this and choose words that resonate with how you felt physically in that moment. So have a go. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this, and again there'll be silence while you do that. You might race through it, you might take some time to do it. That's absolutely fine. So have a go and see what happens. Okay, so that's just about 2 minutes that you've had. And I've chosen, I decided to choose a moment of joy or well-being for this, because I think equally this could be used to just try and describe a very difficult moment in your life. But perhaps this is not the arena to do that. So I thought it would be good to choose a moment of well-being rather than an opposite. And as I say, it can be used to just, it's a very powerful way of honing down your thoughts and your feelings for some difficult things. I use this technique quite a lot. And I didn't realize that it was a technique at the time, but I found myself instinctively trying to write poems with 1, 2, or 3 words in each line when I was we were going through our fertility treatment. And it had that effect of that I keep talking about, of bringing the head and the body back together again. And it's a way of translating, all poetry, not just this type, not just writing like this. All poetry is a way of translating something from an unmanageable space into what might be a locus of control in a few words. And what emerges even from the dark stuff can be something really beautiful. And I think that's a very powerful part of poetry. One of the things I would say about poetry is, don't worry if you don't know where you're going with a poem. If you start writing and you just don't know. I don't know a poet that writes every poem from a place of knowing. We use poetry as a way of exploring, and I think that's important to keep in mind, and that takes the pressure off a bit. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is I didn't get a maths qualification at all when I was at school. And I didn't do any kind of physics. So I've set myself the challenge of writing poetry about quantum physics in order to try and understand it. That might sound absolutely mad, but I'm really enjoying the process of doing it and finding ways of explaining quantum physics to me so that I can write them in poetry. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to share with you a poem that I wrote. I'm going to show you how journaling and poetry can coexist. So this poem came from something I wrote in my journal. And the story behind it is that in a past life, long before I was a counsellor, I was cabin crew for a large airline. And I found myself one day in Boston in a shop, and there was this cushion in the window. And from nowhere, I suddenly thought that cushion would be a perfect gift for my child. And this is before I'd even thought about children. Children hadn't entered my mind at all. So all of a sudden, I was in that mind space of having a potential child in a way. And I bought the cushion and I queued up to pay for it, but I had this awful feeling that I was somehow jinxing things, and I had that feeling for a long, long time, and I wanted to write about this experience and was never really able to until last year, when I wrote a series of poems for fertility, National Fertility Awareness Week, and this poem came out of a line I wrote in my journal, which was, I had no idea if you would like blue cotton with white applique horses, but that was the first time I thought of you. And that's what you'll see. When I read the poem to you, you'll see that's the first lines of the poem. And it's called Jinx. I had no idea if you would like blue cotton with white applique horses, but that was the first time I thought of you as I queued to pay for your gift, clutching it between my arm and my breast, rummaging for my purse. And I did wonder if I was jinxing things, if I should return the cushion safely to its shelf, but the woman with the child ahead of me left her place in line, so I was nixed. And in the second I had to change my mind, I placed your cushion beside my $30, and it was bought and bagged before my grief-lagged brain could create the mind that one day would learn to unconceive you. the end of that poem was a complete surprise to me. What I was just saying earlier, we don't know where we're going with poems. I had no idea I was going to write that one day we'd learn to unconceive you. I didn't have the conscious thought in my mind that that was a process that I was going through. And I wrote the poem without punctuation, and I left it like that because I felt that it reflected, for me, it reflected that moment of being in the queue and being a bit flummoxed by what I was about to do. But what was really important was when I wrote it, I was able to look at myself as a human being rather than blaming myself as somebody who shouldn't have done what she did. And I think that was a really important part of writing this poem. That really is what I wanted to say about poetry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with a bit of a gift. Unfortunately, because of copyright, I'm not able to reproduce this poem as a whole. I'm just going to read out the very beginning of it. It's a poem called A Blessing by someone called James Arlington Wright. And the poem talks about a moment of joy. It describes very simply, in very uncomplicated language, a moment of utter joy. And I've put the first few lines of the poem, and I'll read out the last few lines. And it describes two people arriving at a field where their horses, they've passed this field with horses, and it just describes that moment of being with the horses and simply slowing down and allowing the horses to kind of guide them, really. I think it really reflects that sense of the physical and the psychological coming together and being able to express something almost unexpressible. So the first bit of the poem is: just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass, and the eyes of those two Indian ponies darken with kindness. They have come gladly out of the willows to welcome my friend and me. He then goes on in the poem to describe how they meet the ponies. And at the end of the poem, he writes, and the light breeze moves me to caress her long ear, that is delicate as the skin over a girl's wrist. Suddenly I realised that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. And I think that really describes something that's almost indescribable, that surprise at the end of breaking into blossom. And I really hope that this has helped you to express in your own unique way your experiences, so that maybe one day you also will be able to write something that makes you feel as if you're breaking into blossom. I've written an information sheet, and a lot of resources are on there. Where to find the rest of this poem is on there as well. And I just want to say as well that poetry and journaling are not the only things that have helped me. Counselling, support from friends, talking, walking, nature, they've all helped me. But journaling and poetry have been like the Phillips screwdriver and the Allen key in my toolbox. And I hope that you found this a launch pad for your endeavours in writing and journaling. So thank you very much.
Hello everybody, thank you so much Deborah for that. I have got to say that it's been really lovely just to get some ideas for a structure to get us started. And I know that we don't have to necessarily follow that structure, but when you're starting something from scratch, it's always nice to have a structure just to get you started expressing your feelings and expressing any sadness or grief, etc., that you feel. Now, there were so many great parts about what you did tonight. It really was a fantastic presentation. And I've got a few questions that I would like to ask you.
Brilliant.
Now, you talk about sometimes you can just set a timer and write whatever comes into your head. But what I really want to know, Deborah, is are there times that during the course of a day, there's an event or a thought that comes into your head that makes you think, I can't wait to get home to journal that because I don't want to lose it?
Yeah. I do, and I carry a little book with me, a little notebook, and I'm completely lost without it. And I do jot down little notes as I go through the day. The other technique I've used is carrying a stick-it notepad with me as well, and that's a great way. It gives you it's a great discipline as well, because it means you have to be brief on a stick-it note, so you can bullet point. And some people, there's a thing now called bullet point journaling. You might have heard of it, I don't know, but it's a trend at the moment, and people have diaries where they just literally write in amongst their shopping list or a to-do list. They'll write something that's annoyed them or something that's really made them feel good. And so your journaling can just literally be bullet points as well. But yes, that sense, I often get that feeling if I've got to write this down either as a poem. Oh, this would be a great poem. I'm always saying that.
Well, I mean, I found your poem about the cushion really, really powerful. Did it take away the guilt that you felt for buying that cushion before you even, because I think that so often within the childless community, we put a lot of guilt onto ourselves, and we think it might be something that we did. I mean, you talked about the jinx. So did writing that poem take away that guilt for you?
It did, actually. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't kind of, oh my God, I don't feel guilty anymore. Yeah. What it did was help me reframe the experience of buying the cushion that day. I was able to see it. I felt as if I was on the ceiling of the shop, looking at the young woman who was buying the cushion, and suddenly was able to forgive her. I mean, why wouldn't you buy a cushion, a beautiful little cushion? Why wouldn't you think this might be for my child in the future? And I think it released something in me, actually writing it down, being able to write the word jinx down. I had never written that word before, and calling it jinx as well. You know, that was a really powerful act for me. So I'm not going to say that suddenly I feel absolutely, completely no guilt at all, but there's a huge amount of power in being able to reframe something and seeing it from a different point of view and forgiving yourself. I think that's a really important thing.
So although that word jinx hadn't occurred to you, it was obviously there.
Yes, absolutely. It must have been sitting in there, and it came out as a poem.
Yeah, that's really powerful, isn't it? I'm just going to have a look and see what other questions we've got here. There's a comment here saying thank you for a really interesting presentation. So other people feel the same way as I do, which is lovely to know.
Thank you very much.
Another comment, I think it was really important that you stressed people don't have to journal every day, that there is no pressure attached, but it should be something that you enjoy and find cathartic. And that's true, isn't it?
So true. And I think it's the one major thing that really put me off journaling was that sense of not, missing a day and then feeling guilty and then having to apologize to whom? I mean, who am I apologizing to? So journal when you want to journal. It's not. It shouldn't be a chore. It should be about taking a moment for yourself and just thinking, I'm going to going to explore this a little bit more and writing it down, you don't even have to finish what you're writing. That's a huge power of the journal. It's the one place, you know, we have to finish reports, we have to finish letters, we have to finish emails. A journal is a place you actually don't need to. I've got lots of hanging sentences in my journal, so that's fine.
There's another question here, and somebody has felt exactly the same as I did about the Jinx poem. It says, the Jinx poem had me in tears and explained nearly perfectly an exact moment in my life caught in my head, but never ever released. What are the advantages, disadvantages of showing very personal poems to people?
That's a really, really interesting question, a really good question as well. I think you've got to feel ready to share. You must never feel pressured to share anything that's personal. And I certainly didn't feel pressured to share that with you. I wouldn't have shared it had it been so raw that I couldn't cope with reading it out, for instance. And I think that also some of the power in poetry comes from telling it slant. That means that you don't necessarily have to say everything in a very direct way. You can couch things in metaphor. So you can talk about you could talk about the way the sea moves, the movement of the sea as a way of expressing grief, for instance. The breaking into blossom is a way of expressing, a great way of showing how metaphor can really say more than, you know, than what the author of that poem actually felt. So being able to use a metaphor or another vehicle for your grief can be very powerful as well. So you don't have to say things directly. You can have your own code, if you like, for your poems. But what I would say is that share. One of the things I didn't say actually when I did the writing exercise was that in my writing workshops we do share. I encourage people to share if they want to, if they feel confident enough to, and we're not sharing and commenting on the quality of the writing, more about commenting on how the piece made us feel or if we identified with it. And I think sometimes in a very safe space in a writing workshop, you can share very difficult things, but you get that immediate support and immediate feedback at the time, something that I wasn't able to do obviously in this webinar. But in terms of sharing a poem in the wider world, yes, you have to be ready to share it if it's a very personal thing, and be ready. You have to let it go. Once it's out, it's gone. You have to be ready to let that poem go and for people to judge it. And people might not judge it, you know, positively. They might not see what you see in it. So yeah, it's a very, very good question.
Tonight, I definitely think there's been shared understanding. I think that's come through in the questions and also just from reading the poems that you showed us and also the journal entry. I think there's a very strong sense of shared understanding, and that is immediately making me feel better because already I'm realising that other people understand feelings that I might have encountered in the past, and I think that's really important. There's one more question that I would just like to read out to you, and it's about sharing anonymously. So it says, do you think sharing something anonymously is a way to release feelings and feel a little stronger?
That's another very interesting question. And some people do share anonymously, and there are anonymous blogs as well. And I think it's a very personal thing. Some people find a great deal, they find value in actually being identified, and being able for somebody to recognize recognize their experience, and there's a huge amount of power in having your experience acknowledged and recognized. And some people, just knowing that it's going out there in the world and somebody else is sharing it, that's absolutely fine for them. So I think it's a very personal thing. I don't think there's a particularly definitive answer that I can give for that, but it's a really, really good question, and possibly something that I'd like to talk about more actually in a discussion. It sounds like it would be a great discussion piece as well.
And I think possibly that could change as well at different stages in a journey. Somebody, maybe at the beginning of coming to terms with their grief that they're feeling, they might not feel ready to share something and put their name to it. But as they gain confidence and realise that other people share those feelings too, and that their feelings might actually help others, then they might decide that it is time for them to put their name to it and get a sense of empowerment from it.
That's great what you've just said. Absolutely. And I know that on my blog, I've had people write to me sometimes and they say, I just want somebody to read this. I don't want it to be put on your blog. And some people are happy for me to put a comment or put a poem on there. So I guess it does reflect that notion of being at different stages in the journey, in the grief journey, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, for those amazing questions.
Thank you. Yes, I second that.
Okay, I'm just going to move this over a bit so that I can see this final slide that we've got here.
Yep. It's just a slide with some of my contact details. I'm planning on running some it's called Write to Create, some Skype sessions, creative writing support groups in 2019. And if you sign up to my blog, you'll get immediate, as soon as it comes out, you'll know the dates, and because it's Skype, spaces are limited. So feel free to have a look.
It sounds very exciting. I hope lots of people access that, and I know I certainly will be.
Great. Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Heather, for being a fantastic coordinator and for being there with us this evening. It's been great.
Do you know, it has been an absolute pleasure, Deborah. And I just want to tell everybody that I've got this fantastic resource sheet that you mentioned earlier. So I'm going to be sending that out to all attendees who are watching live tonight. It was put together by Deborah, and it really complements the information that's on our slides, and it's got some additional information on there as well. It gives details of articles, books and writing prompts that may be of use to you. If you're watching the recording and you would like a copy of this resource sheet, please email heather@fertilitynetworkuk.org and I can arrange to have it sent out to you. Deborah, I think that's all there is time for tonight. Thank you so much for supporting More to Life with all the preparation and time that has gone into this really fabulous session. I can't tell you how amazing it's been to be part of this tonight.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
It really has been a pleasure to host you. We do hope to have the recording of this available on YouTube in the next week or so. So everybody, this is the last webinar in the 2018 series, and we hope to post details of the 2019 series very soon. Just keep an eye on our Twitter and our Facebook account, and the More to Life website as well, just to have a look to see when we post details of those, but they should be coming up soon. Remember, it's www.fertilitynetworkuk.org for our website. Many thanks for tuning in to these sessions. We couldn't do it without you, the attendees, and of course our wonderful guest speakers. But thank you for tuning in throughout the year, and I hope to see each and every one of you in 2019. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.